Tales from Childhood, written by Roald Dahl, Part 6. In later years, when we were all in a little order and could swim, the daily routine became different. By then, my mother had acquired a motor boat, a small and not very seaworthy white wooden vessel which sat far too low in the water and was powered by an unreliable one cylinder engine. The fairly half brother was the only one who could make the engine go at all. It was extremely difficult to start, and he always had to unscrew the sparking plug and pour petrol into the cylinder. Then he swung a flywheel round and round, and with a bit of luck, after a lot of coughing and sputtering, the thing would finally get going. When we first acquired the motor boat, my youngest sister was 4 and I was 7, and by then all of us had learned to swim. The exciting new boat made it possible for us to go much farther afield, and every day we would travel far out into the fjord hunting for a different island. There were hundreds of them to choose from. Some were very small, no more than 30 yards long. Others were quite large, maybe half a mile in length. It was wonderful to have such a choice of places, and it was terrific fun to explore each island before we went swimming off the rocks. There were the wooden skeletons of shipwrecked boats on those islands, and big white bones, were they human bones? And wild raspberries and mussels clinging to the rocks, and some of the islands had shaggy, long haired goats on them, and even sheep. Now and then, when we are out in the open water beyond the chain of islands, the sea became very rough, and that was when my mother enjoyed herself most. Nobody, not even the tiny children, bothered with life belts in those days. We would cling to the sides of our funny little white motor boat, driving through mountainous white capped waves and getting drenched to the skin while my mother calmly handled the tiller. There were times, I promise you, when the waves were so high that we slid down into a trough. The whole world disappeared from sight. Then up and up the little boat would climb, standing almost vertically on its tail, until we reached the crest of the next wave, and then it was like being on top of a foaming mountain. It requires great skill to handle a small boat in seas like these. The thing can easily capsize or be swamped if the bows do not meet the great combing breakers at just the right angle. But my mother knew exactly how to do it, and we were never afraid. We loved every minute of it, all of us, except for our long suffering nanny, who would bury her face in her hands and call aloud upon the Lord to save her soul. In the early evenings, we nearly always went out fishing. We collected mussels from the rocks for bait. Then we got into either the rowboat or the motor boat and pushed off to drop anchor later in some likely spot. The water was very deep, and often we had to let out 200 feet of line before we touched the bottom. We would sit silent and tense, waiting for a bait, and it always amazed me how even a little nibble at the end of that long line would be transmitted to one's fingers. A bait, someone would shout, jerking the line. I've got him. It's a big one. It's a whooper. And then came the thrill of hauling in the line, hand over hand, and peering over the side into the clear water to see how big the fish really was as he reached the surface. Cod, whiting, haddock, and mackerel. We caught them all and bore them back triumphantly to the hotel kitchen where the cheery fat woman who did the cooking promised to get them ready for supper. I tell you, my friends, those were the days. I have only one unpleasant memory of the summer holidays in Norway. We were in the grandparents' house in Oslo, and my mother said to me, "We are going to the doctor this afternoon. He wants to look at your nose and mouth." I think I was 8 at the time. "What is wrong with my nose and mouth?" I asked. "Nothing much," my mother said. "But I think you have got adenoids." "What are they?" I asked. "Don't worry about it," she said. "It is nothing." I held my mother's hand as we walked to the doctor's house. It took us about half an hour. There was a kind of dentist's chair in the surgery, and I was lifted into it. The doctor had a round mirror strapped to his forehead, and he peered up my nose and into my mouth. He then took my mother aside and they held a whispered conversation. I saw my mother looking rather grim, but she nodded. The doctor now put some water to boil in an aluminium mug over a gas flame, and into the boiling water he placed a long, thin, shiny steel instrument. I sat there watching the steam coming off the boiling water. I was not in the least apprehensive. I was too young to realize that something out of the ordinary was going to happen. Then a nurse dressed in white came in. She was carrying a red rubber apron and a curved white enamel bowl. She put the apron over the front of my body and tied it around my neck. It was far too big. Then she held the enamel bowl under my chin. The curve of the bowl fitted perfectly against the curve of my chest. The doctor was bending over me. In his hand, he held that long, shiny steel instrument. He held it right in front of my face, and to this day I can still describe it perfectly. It was about the thickness and length of a pencil, and like most pencils, it had a lot of sides to it. Towards the end, the metal became much thinner, and at the very end of the thin bit of metal, there was a tiny blade set at an angle. The blade was not more than a centimeter long, very small, very sharp, and very shiny. "Open your mouth," the doctor said, speaking Norwegian. I refused. I thought he was going to do something to my teeth, and everything anyone had ever done to my teeth had been painful. "It won't take 2 seconds," the doctor said. He spoke gently, and I was seduced by his voice. Like an ass, I opened my mouth. The tiny blade flashed in the bright light and disappeared into my mouth. It went high up into the roof of my mouth, and the hand that held the blade gave 4 or 5 very quick little twists, and the next moment Out of my mouth into the basin came tumbling a whole mass of flesh and blood. I was too shocked and outraged to do anything but yelp. I was horrified by the huge red lump that had fallen out of my mouth into the wide basin, and my first thought was that the doctor had cut out the whole of my middle of my head. Those were your adenoids, I heard the doctor saying. I sat there gasping. The roof of my mouth seemed to be on fire. I grabbed my mother's hand and held on to it tight. I could not believe that anyone would do this to me. Stay where you are, the doctor said. You'll be all right in a minute. Blood was still coming out of my mouth and dripping into the basin the nurse was holding. Spit it all out, she said. There is a good boy. You will be able to breathe much better through your nose after this, the doctor said. The nurse wiped my lips and washed my face with a wet flannel. Then they lifted me out of the chair and stood me on my feet. I felt a bit groggy. We will get you home, my mother said, taking my hand. Down the stairs we went and onto the street. We started walking. I said walking. No trolley car or taxi. We walked the full half our journey back to my grandparents' house, and when we arrived at last, I can remember as clearly as anything my grandmother saying, let him sit down in that chair and rest for a while. After all, he has had an operation. Someone placed a chair for me beside my grandmother's armchair, and I sat down. My grandmother reached over and covered one of my hands in both of hers. That won't be the last time you will go to a doctor in your life, she said, and with a bit of luck, they won't do you too much harm. That was in 1924, and taking out a child's adenoids and often the tonsils as well without any anesthetic was common practice in those days. I wonder, though, what you would think if some doctor did that to you today. Thank you for listening.